On a cold March night in 1566, the stone heart of Edinburgh beat with a sound it would never forget. The walls of Holyrood Palace, gray, ancient, and unyielding, were lit by the trembling glow of candles, their light rippling across tapestries of hunts and battles. Somewhere deep within, in the Queen's private chambers, a dinner of quiet laughter and gentle conversation unfolded. Outside those doors, in the spiral stairwell that coiled like the spine of a serpent, boots pounded upward. They were coming! No trumpet of war announced them. No royal decree summoned their presence. They came like wolves into a sheepfold, steel hidden in the folds of velvet cloaks, eyes cold and fixed upon their prey. In a matter of minutes, one man's life would be extinguished, not in the chaos of the battlefield, but in the lamplight intimacy of a domestic room. He would die not from a soldier's blow, but from the frenzy of noblemen turned assassins, each driven by a toxic blend of jealousy, fear, and political hunger. His name was David Rizzio, musician, courtier, foreigner. He had risen from nothing to sit at the right hand of Mary, Queen of Scots. Too close, far too close. Close enough to speak into her ear in the language of her youth. Close enough to make her laugh when her marriage to Lord Darnley was crumbling. Close enough to become the object of whispered scandals, that the child in her womb was his, not her husband's. It did not matter if the rumors were true. In Renaissance Scotland, the perception of power was often more dangerous than the power itself. And tonight, perception had sharpened into a dagger. In mere moments, the Queen's private sanctuary would be violated, the air filled with the scrape of steel and the cries of a man fighting to live. He would clutch at Mary's gown in desperation, his blood soaking into the fabric, while her husband stood complicit among the killers. 50 stab wounds would carve their message into his flesh, a warning to anyone who dared to stand too near the throne. Holyrood would never be the same, neither would Scotland. Part 1. The Outsider in the Queen's Court. David Rizzio arrived in Scotland like a whisper smuggled in on the wind from across the sea. No parade marked his arrival, no proclamations of noble lineage, only a man with eyes quick as blades, a tongue fluent in half a dozen languages, and hands that could draw music from strings as if coaxing gold from stone. Born in the shadow of the Italian Alps, the son of a court musician, he carried with him the disciplined elegance of the continent, the courtesy of Turin, the wit of Paris, the quiet confidence of a man who knew his worth even if the world did not. Mary, Queen of Scots, had returned from France in 1561, a widow at 19. She stepped ashore, not just with a crown on her head, but with the invisible weight of a lost French king in her heart. Scotland was hers in law and title, yet it felt almost like enemy ground. Its language sharp and unfamiliar, its nobles proud and bristling, suspicious of anything touched by French hands or Catholic rites. She longed for the grace of the Valois court she had left behind, the silken diplomacy, the subtle dance of words and gestures. And then came Rizzio. At first, he was no more than a bass singer in the Queen's modest musical ensemble, a shadow among the harmonies, a foreign note in the royal chorus. But in courts, as on battlefields, the right skill at the right moment can change a man's fate. His voice was rich and commanding, his humor disarming, his manners sharpened to a continental polish that stood in elegant contrast to the rough-hewn bluntness of the Scottish lairds. In the Queen's presence, he spoke not as a supplicant, but as an equal in the private realm of intellect and art. Music opened the door, but politics kept it ajar. Mary saw in him something rare: discretion without servility, counsel without ambition, at least not the kind of ambition that threatened her. He could switch from Italian to French to English with ease, and he understood the unspoken currents of conversation, where a pause could be more revealing than a speech. Within 3 years, he had traded his singer's place for a desk piled with parchment and sealed letters. In 1564, he was named her private secretary for French correspondence, a position that was far more than ink and paper. It meant entry into the Queen's inner circle, access to the pulse of her thoughts and the corridors of her strategy. His chambers were moved closer to hers, a silent proclamation of trust. He dined with her, laughed with her, and sometimes, when business lingered late into the evening, he stayed in the warm lamplight of her private rooms long after the rest of the court had dispersed into the drafty halls of Holyrood. But proximity to a monarch is a double-edged gift. To Mary, he was a friend and a steady hand in a court of coiled serpents. To the Scottish nobility, he was a foreign leech, drinking deeply from the Queen's favor while bypassing the traditional ladders of rank and bloodline. Their resentment found fertile ground in the rumors that spread from hall to tavern that the Italian meddled in affairs of state, that he whispered Catholic counsels into the Queen's ear, that he was placing foreign names into Scottish offices to serve the Pope's designs. And then came the most dangerous whisper of all, the one spoken in low tones over ale and in the corners of candlelit corridors, that the child swelling beneath Mary's silk gowns was not the son or daughter of Lord Darnley, but of David Rizzio himself. In a kingdom already teetering between faiths, where the Reformation had turned neighbors into enemies, such a claim was more than gossip. It was tinder in a dry forest. To the Protestant lords, Rizzio was not merely an irritant or an interloper. He was a spark thrown into the powder house of Scotland, and the fuse once lit would be impossible to put out. Part 2. The fuse is lit. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was meant to be the solution to every problem gnawing at Mary's reign. He had the height and the golden hair of a storybook prince, the royal blood of both Scotland and England running in his veins. On paper, he was perfect, a Protestant to calm the fears of her lords, yet a Tudor descendant with a claim to the English throne, a political bridge between two crowns forever circling each other like wary predators. But the neat lines of politics rarely survived the mess of human nature. The man behind the titles was young, too young, and fatally intoxicated by the taste of power. He craved the honor of kingship, but shunned the labor of it, spending more hours in sport and drink than in council chambers. Worse still, he could not abide the fact that his wife, the Queen of Scots, did not lean on him for counsel. Instead, she turned to another, David Rizzio, the Italian with the soft voice and sharper mind, whose very presence in Mary's private rooms felt to Darnley like a slow-burning insult. Jealousy was the first worm to burrow into his pride. Then came the whispers. They spread through Edinburgh like smoke in winter, curling into every corner. The child in Mary's womb, was it truly Darnley's? Or had the Italian, with his late-night conversations and his too familiar proximity, sown something far more intimate than political counsel? The rumor did not need to be believed to be deadly. Pride cares little for truth. It feeds on perception, and perception was turning against him. Far from the Queen's chambers, in the smoky warmth of Edinburgh's great houses, other men were listening to these rumors with cold calculation. The Protestant lords, James Douglas, Earl of Morton, Patrick Ruthven, Lord Ruthven, the Earl of Lindsay, were veterans of a different kind of war. They had survived the chaos of the Reformation, sharpened their instincts in the brutal politics of the Scottish court, and they knew the scent of weakness when it drifted into reach. Darnley was that weakness. They gathered around him the way crows circle a dying stag, each pretending sympathy, each seeing a weapon where others saw a wounded man. They stroked his bruised pride, fanned the embers of his jealousy into flame, and promised him the one thing his vanity craved above all, the crown matrimonial. With that title, he would no longer be merely the Queen's consort. He would be her equal, her co-sovereign, his name beside hers on every decree and treaty. It was a perfect lie. The lords had no intention of sharing power with Darnley. They wanted him as a blade, not as a king. Once the Queen was broken and the Italian removed, Darnley would be discarded like the scabbard after the sword was drawn. The plan took root in the dark heart of the winter of 1565-66. In public, their cause was wrapped in the noble language of patriotism and piety. They accused Rizzio of being an agent of the Pope, corrupting the Queen, undermining the Protestant faith, and selling Scottish independence to foreign powers. But beneath the gilded words lay the real truth: fear. Fear that a foreigner was eclipsing them in the Queen's favor. Fear that Mary might one day govern without needing their swords, their votes, or their permission. And so the decision was made. Rizzio would die, not by poison in a goblet, not by a knife in some shadowed street, but in a way so public, so spectacular, that it would carve terror into the hearts of every courtier who might dream of stepping too close to Mary Stuart. The date was fixed. The place was certain. They would not have to hunt him. On the night of March 9th, he would be dining with their Queen. Part 3. The night of March 9th. The day had bled into evening, and Holyrood Palace exhaled into a quiet rare in royal life. Mary, 6 months with child, had chosen the comfort of a small private supper over the formal stiffness of a state banquet. In her private chambers, 20 feet square, warmed by a fire, its walls dressed in hunting scene tapestries, she gathered with only a few she trusted: her half-brother Robert Stuart, the Countess of Argyll, and David Rizzio. The Queen's apartments were tucked behind a narrow spiral stair, a natural fortress of stone. In the dim gold of candlelight, the table glimmered with pewter plates and silver goblets. Conversation drifted from court gossip to poetry, to the latest letters from France. Rizzio, in a doublet of rich damask and hose of fine wool, played the role he knew best: witty, attentive, effortlessly weaving charm through the air. It was almost enough to make her forget the storm that had been gathering. Almost. Down in the belly of the palace, boots struck stone in slow, deliberate rhythm. The conspirators had begun their climb. At their head was Lord Darnley, Mary's husband, her betrayer, moving with the strained composure of a man about to commit himself to an irreversible act. Behind him came Lord Ruthven, pale as a ghost, his armor creaking over a body so ill he had risen from his sickbed to kill. The Queen heard them before she saw them. Footsteps on the stair, a door opening, And there was Darnley, suddenly at her side, smiling without warmth, placing himself between her and the door. "What brings you here, my lord?" she asked, her tone polite, her eyes narrowing. Before he could answer, Ruthven stepped into the room, his face like carved stone, and behind him came Steele, Morton, Lindsay, and a knot of armed men forcing their way into the small chamber. The air shifted from the soft crackle of the hearth to the sharp tang of iron. Mary rose. "By what right do you enter my private rooms with weapons drawn?" Ruthven's reply was as cold as the night outside. "We come for David Rizzio. He leaves with us." In that instant, the supper was gone, replaced by a tableau of threat and betrayal. Rizzio's back was to the wall, his chair trapped between the table and the armed men. His hand gripped the edge of Mary's gown. His eyes, wide, dark, already seeing the truth, looked to her for protection. Outside the palace windows, the night deepened. Inside, the walls were closing in. Part 4. 50 Blades in the Candlelight. It began with a threat aimed at the unborn heir of Scotland. Andrew Kerr of Fawdenside stepped forward, pistol leveled at the swell of Mary's belly. His voice was flat, almost bored, as if he were announcing the terms of a game. "Stand aside, madam, or your child dies first." The queen froze. Her body remained between the killers and their prey, but her mind raced. She could not gamble with her child's life, not against men whose eyes held no hesitation. That heartbeat of paralysis was all they needed. A dagger flashed. George Douglas, using a blade that belonged to Darnley himself, leaned over Mary's shoulder and drove the point into Rizzio's side. The sound was wet, abrupt, followed by a cry that ripped through the chamber like torn silk. Blood spattered across the queen's gown, warm and immediate. The first blow broke the dam. They seized Rizzio, dragging him from the queen's grasp. His fingers tore at her sleeves until the fabric ripped. He was hauled across the room toward the doorway, his feet skidding on the rush-strewn floor. Daggers rose and fell, each strike punctuated by the grunts and curses of men working in murderous rhythm. Mary shouted for them to stop, her voice lost under the scrape of steel against bone, the chaotic shuffle of boots, and the guttural gasps of a man fighting to breathe. Rizzio clawed at his attackers, his body twisting in desperate resistance. He was strong, but terror makes a man's strength scatter, and the press of blades was everywhere. The killing was not swift. Even when he sagged, his knees buckling under him, they stabbed again and again, as if each man needed to leave his own signature in blood. Over 50 wounds in total, slashes to the chest, punctures to the back, cuts to the face. His voice faltered to a hoarse rasp, then silence. But still the knives worked, carving away the man they had feared and hated. When at last they stepped back, the body lay crumpled in the doorway between the dining chamber and Mary's bedchamber, half in light, half in shadow, as if even death could not decide where to place him. Blood ran into the cracks of the wooden floor, pooling dark and viscous beneath his still form. The queen stood rigid, her face white as plaster, her hands trembling not from fear for herself, but from the raw helplessness of having watched her friend butchered an arm's length away. The chamber smelled of sweat, iron, and something deeper, a lingering violence that would never entirely leave these walls. In the flicker of candlelight, the killers looked less like lords and more like butchers. Part 5. The Queen Strikes Back. They left him where he fell. David Rizzio, musician, secretary, confidant, now only a heap of torn silk and cooling flesh. His blood seeped into the oak boards, creeping toward the hearth in slow, dark fingers. No one moved to cover him. The body was as much a warning as it was a corpse. Mary sat frozen in her chair, her gown stiff with blood. Around her, the conspirators stood in the smug stillness of men who believed the game was already won. Darnley voided her eyes. Lord Ruthven, pale and sweating from the exertion, slumped into a chair as if death itself had brushed past him. They spoke in low voices about restoring order, about purging the Queen's court of foreign poison. They had turned her chambers into a slaughterhouse, and now they intended to make her a prisoner in it. For 2 nights she was kept under guard in Holyrood, the air thick with the iron stink of Rizzio's blood. She ate little, slept less, but her mind worked. Mary Stuart was no stranger to political storms, and she understood the cracks that ran through every alliance. Darnley was her way out, weak, vain, and already beginning to suspect the lords meant to use him and discard him. She played to his fears, whispered in the quiet hours about how Morton and Ruthven had no intention of granting him the crown matrimonial, how once she was under their full control, his usefulness would end, perhaps at the point of the same daggers that had ended Rizzio. She reminded him that the nobles did not love him. They merely needed him, and need was fleeting. It worked. On the night of March 11th, under a sky smeared with cloud, Mary made her move. Disguised in a dark cloak, with Darnley at her side and a handful of loyal servants, she slipped past the guards, the spiral stairs, the echoing corridors, the gates, all behind her now. By dawn, she was riding hard toward Dunbar Castle, the cold air tearing the last of Holyrood's stench from her lungs. From Dunbar, she summoned her allies. The call was answered. Men rode to her banner, and within days she returned not as a captive queen, but as a sovereign with an army at her back. The conspirators scattered, some into exile, some stripped of lands and titles, some hiding behind the very walls they once thought impregnable. The lords had spilled blood to break her, but it had only steeled her. Rizzio's murder had been meant to cripple her rule. Instead, it had burned away illusions. She knew now exactly what her enemies were capable of, and she would never again mistake courtesy for loyalty. In Holyrood, the floorboards of her chamber bore a dark, irregular stain where Rizzio had died. No matter how many times they were scrubbed, sanded, or replaced, the mark returned, as if the wood itself refused to forget. And neither, she vowed, would she. Epilogue: the blood that would not fade. Centuries have passed since that March night, but in Holyrood Palace, the air still remembers. Guides will tell you the story in hushed tones, their voices echoing in the same narrow stairwell where boots once pounded toward murder. In the Queen's former chambers, visitors leaned down to see the stain in the wood, dark, irregular, stubborn as memory. Some say it is nothing more than the byproduct of age and polish. Others swear it is Rizzio's blood, seeping up from beneath the boards, refusing to be erased. Legends grew in the centuries that followed. Strange noises in the night, footsteps where no one walks, a chill that slides down the spine in a room still warm with sunlight. Some say they've seen a figure in fine 16th century dress, his doublet torn, his face pale, his eyes wide, in a silent plea. But the ghost is more than a superstition. It is a reminder. Rizzio's death was not the work of madmen in a fit of rage. It was a calculated act of political violence, committed by nobles who convinced themselves that murder was duty. In their minds, they were not assassins, but saviors of the realm, cleansing Scotland of a foreign corruption. That certainty, cold, righteous, and blind, made their blades all the more dangerous. Mary survived that night. She outwitted her captors, reclaimed her throne, and sent many of her enemies into exile. But the victory came at a cost. She had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that in the game of power, trust was a luxury too costly to keep. And though she walked away from Holyrood with her crown still on her head, the shadow of Rizzio's murder never truly left her. 4.5 centuries later, the lesson remains. Power breeds envy. Envy breeds fear. And fear, dressed in the robes of patriotism or faith, will always find a dagger. The blood in the floorboards of Holyrood may be nothing more than pigment in ancient oak. Or perhaps it is something older, something heavier, the stubborn memory of a night when music turned to screams, when friendship turned to betrayal, and when the heart of a kingdom beat faster, not from love or hope, but from the frenzy of 50 blades in candlelight. And maybe that is why the stain never fades.